So I grew up in a small town before the dawn of Netflix, which naturally meant that I needed to find creative ways of entertaining myself. Being rather adventurous and hopped up on Coca-Cola more often than not, I found my entertainment by climbing roofs, specifically hockey arenas. Now, while my brothers played hockey, my friends and I would circle around the arena to locate the best place where we could climb up. And we weren't very subtle, and we were only caught once. We once built our own set of staircase out of picnic tables and wooden crates and garbage bins and anything else that we could find on the hockey arena's property. And we were actually charged $1,500 because of this masterpiece, because someone would need to pay somebody to tear down our staircase, and tearing it down ourselves was a safety liability. But of course, my teenage self didn't learn my lesson, and I continued to climb roofs for many years to come because the thrill of entering a space that I was not allowed to go was entirely too exciting. Now, there were a few times in a few hockey arenas where we weren't able to find a place to climb up, and that was quite frustrating. But it was easy for me to find this type of stuff enjoyable more often than not, because I'm actually someone who is allowed to travel wherever I please. It becomes less enjoyable when someone is consistently denied access to certain spaces. And when this is the case, responses can be understandably quite negative. Now, our places of worship are no exception to this. In the distant past, the Israelites knew these exclusive spaces, these spaces we weren't allowed to go. The Holy of Holies within the Temple of Jerusalem illustrates this concept quite well. With the Ark of the Covenant inside, with the 10 Commandments inside of that, this space was separated from the rest of the community by a 4-inch veil that reached at least 30 feet tall. Some writers are even bold enough to say that the veil was so thick that if you tied 2 horses together with ropes and pulled on either end, that it wouldn't rip. Now, I'm not sure if I believe that, but the design is blunt in its purpose, that nobody could accidentally slip through 4 inches of fabric, and no one was meant to. The significance of this space was that it was believed to be God's earthly dwelling. To enter this space was to enter the direct presence of God himself. Now, only the high priest could do this once a year to make atonement for sins. The presence of God remained shielded from man behind a thick curtain during much of Israel's history. Now, without knowing this, Christians fail to realize something significant about Christ's death. Matthew 27:50-51 reads, "And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom." See, the sacrificial death of Christ put an end to the Levitical sacrificial system. Suddenly, God's presence was not contained to this exclusive space. It was accessible to all people in all places. It wasn't just the Jewish high priest that could step into the presence of God. Even racial divides between the Jews and the Gentiles were rendered unimportant, and everyone involved was able to approach and access God through Christ. This is why the issue of accessibility is so vital to the Christian mission today. Through the death of Christ, God's presence became accessible through the symbolic ripping of the temple's veil. And yet, today, there exist several veils blocking access to the places that we worship as communities. In fact, we may have built these barriers without even knowing it. These issues are particularly relevant for people with physical disabilities. Of course, the word disability has a broad range of meaning, ranging from mental illness to impairments in dexterity. But as recent as 2012, approximately 15% of people over the age of 18 in North America reported having a physical disability. The frequency increases for women and increases with age, with anywhere between 40 to 60% of people 75 years or older in North America reporting a disability that limits complex activity that could include a lot of different things, including climbing stairs. In response to this, a number of years ago, while working at my church back home, the staff participated in an exercise that highlighted the accessibility issues within our church building. It would have been amusing if it wasn't so sad how difficult it was for a wheelchair user, for example, to access something simple like the washroom. We were lucky to have easy access to the sanctuary, and several people who use wheelchairs are actually active members of our congregation. But this was actually in large part due to the fact that our building was recently designed. It was a new building. Not every congregation is as fortunate. Many congregations use older buildings, and they pose many accessibility issues. This is particularly true of designs that unintentionally disallow people with physical disabilities from fully participating in that worship community. Simply put, despite the significant steps already taken on behalf of people with disabilities, veils still exist today in our places of worship. It may not be a fabric that is 4 inches thick, but for some people, stairs can be just as effective a deterrent. Recently, I've been challenged to think about where I place the problem of disability. There are kind of 2 major schools of thought on answering this question. The medical model of disability and the social model of disability. The medical model of disability sees the actual physical condition disadvantaging the individual, whereas the social model of disability places the problem in the socially constructed reality around the body. So the medical model would see the solution as solving the problem of the impaired body itself, whereas the social model would seek to alter the conditions that surround the body. The second model actually suggests that while variations in a body's ability may exist from body to body, these don't actually necessarily need to lead to disability unless society fails to take into account for and include people regardless of their individual differences. Now, both models have their strengths and their weaknesses. While the medical model is criticized for ableism or unintentional social degradation of people with disabilities, the social model is perceived to actually downplay the issues that impairments bring, which can't be rectified by the surrounding environment. The medical model, if applied to biblical theology, would be interested in the healings reported in the Gospels. A body, it has an impairment and it's rectified. The social model would be interested in something else. And I would argue that the ripping of the veil would be significant to the second model, because it signifies a moment in the biblical text that changes the surrounding environment to allow others to do something what they have previously not been allowed to do before, to enter the presence of God. Of course, our churches today are not considered the sole dwelling place of God, but they are a place designed for community, which is theologically understood as a place where God dwells. Matthew 18:20 reminds us that where 2 or 3 are gathered, Christ is in their midst. In this way, then, the excluded Jews and Gentiles of Jesus' day most certainly stand in solidarity with anyone who has struggled to enter a church today, because both would know what it feels like to be denied access to the presence of God. I believe Christians have a responsibility to seriously consider what veils exist within their own church. My own church is a 24/7 homeless shelter, and I believe it does an incredible job of inviting people who are used to being excluded back into community. I am deeply honored to be even mildly associated with this group of Christians. Having said that, a dozen steps separate the male dorm from the rest of the shelter, and a male wheelchair user would not be able to access the services provided by our emergency shelter. Until we change the physical landscape of this shelter, this will be one of my church's veils. Barriers can take several forms beyond physical limitations. These obstacles range from thinking that people with disabilities are inferior to not hiring someone based on a disability, to not considering how the deaf community can participate on a Sunday morning when someone's preaching a sermon. These veils, these barriers for people with disabilities fully participating in a church community are all interrelated and important to consider. My challenge for Christians listening today is to consider in what ways your own church community unintentionally excludes people with disabilities from fully participating in their congregations. What veils exist where you commune together and worship God? I cannot think of a better way of showing love for the world than ensuring that everyone who wants to, no matter what their body type, has the accessibility to worship God alongside a like-minded congregation. When the veil was ripped from top to bottom, God communicated to the world that his presence was made accessible to all. May we honor this by gratefully ripping up our own veils.